Welcome to the 37th episode of A Change is a Chance. My name is Ryan Lowe, and my goal is to educate listeners, especially the youth, on the most polarizing issues in this world by interviewing different experts who can lead us into the charge for change. Today in the United States, there are numerous impassioned social issues that have numerous differing perspectives based on individual experiences, identities, education, circumstances, backgrounds, beliefs, and more. However, these different perspectives can become polarizing and divisive when we struggle to understand our differences, especially within these spaces of social identity and education. So, with the recent rise of conversations about altering how we see American history, there has also been a surge of extreme opposition and polarization. And while these discussions could be positive, it has come to a point of mass toxicity and the inability to even hear the other side at all. Why have we Americans gotten stuck in the seemingly eternal cycle of social friction with name-calling and screaming? Where does this polarization come from, and how can we break free? And today we have Professor Jonathan Zimmerman to help us understand this. Professor Zimmerman is a professor of history of education at the University of Pennsylvania, and his work ponders how our systems of education have evolved over time in the myths that often cloud our understanding of teaching and learning. He has a particular interest in how political and social movements come to shape education. He's also a former Peace Corps volunteer and high school teacher, and has written for a variety of newspapers such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Atlantic. And I had the amazing chance to meet Professor Zimmerman at the Penn Social Justice Research Academy this summer, where he lectured on this very topic. So how are you doing today, Professor Zimmerman?
Very well, Ryan. Thank you for having me.
Okay, let's start with the problem itself. What does the average American political conversation look like today? And how has that affected our ability to talk to each other?
Well, the reason I laugh is that um, the average American political conversation is not actually happening. I think there's a lot of evidence that we're not talking to each other because we've segregated ourselves in ideological bubbles. So Bill Bishop wrote a book a number of years ago called The Big Sort. And the Big Sort refers to the sorting of Americans on ideological grounds. So if you look in the 1970s and you surveyed people with questions like, do you have a friend of a different political party? Do you have a neighbor of a different political party? Do you have a workmate of a different political party? Do you date people in a different political party? Would you be okay with your kid marrying somebody of a different political party? When you ask those same questions in the 2010s, this is even before our era, even 10 years ago, you see that the yes votes are straight line down. So on all those questions, the number of Americans answering yes plummeted. And that's where we live. So look, if you don't encounter people in your daily life who have a different political perspective, you're not going to be very adept at having conversations across those perspectives. Why would you be? I mean, Ryan, I play tennis. I don't play squash. If you put me on a squash court, I would have no idea what to do. And it's not because like I'm a bad person or a dumb person or an unskilled person. It's because I haven't had practice in squash. So it seems to me our inability to talk to each other is what the professors call overdetermined. In other words, it could not be otherwise. If we segregate ourselves, we can't talk to each other, period. We won't know how. We won't have the practice.
Yeah, and one conversation that I had with some friends after your lecture was just about that. Like, I realized I don't really have any friends from the other political party, because if I did, I wouldn't be so, I guess, against that. And I thought about my own biases and just thinking I should probably have more people like that. It could be good for
Well,
me.
it's interesting you use the term against that because I think it depends, Ryan, on what you're talking about being against. As I made clear in the lecture, I don't try to disguise the fact that I'm against Trump and MAGA.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I'm very much for talking with people from that camp. And I see nothing inconsistent about those two things, but some people do, right? Some of my fellow people on the left say, well, if you talk to them, you're giving them a platform or you're giving them credence or um, you're naturalizing it, you're complicit with it, and so on. So those are the barriers. Um, Those are the arguments against talking, and they're very powerful. I don't think they're correct, but I think they're all around us.
Yeah, that's really interesting. People should be able to have, I guess, a conversation, an argument without attacking each other. So let's talk more about the origins of these things. You talked about the history and religion wars we face in the last century. Can you explain these from the beginning and how they affect today?
Well, I don't want to go too deep in the weeds because I know we don't have that much time, but very briefly, in 2002, I wrote a book called Who's America, which was subtitled Cultural Wars in the Public Schools. And it was about the way we argued about history and religion in our schools. And to be as brief as possible, in 2002, I argued that the history wars had the wrong solution and the religion wars had no solution at all. The history wars had the wrong solution because the way we solved them, and I'm using air quotes here, was just by adding another group to the same story. So for most of our history, the history textbooks were only about white men. What we did was we added people that weren't white and weren't men to the story, which, by the way, I think is fantastic. The problem was we folded those groups into the same story instead of asking, well, how might the story change when we start thinking about non-white and non-male experiences? The religion wars, by which I meant creation evolution, school prayer, Bible reading, sex ed, insofar as it was inflected by religion, I argued at the time they had no solution because they just involved mutually inconsistent claims. Either Christ was the Savior and Messiah or he wasn't. Either sex out of marriage is a sin, out of straight marriage is a sin, or it isn't, and so on. And I just felt like they would always be with us because there was no way to compromise or even talk across them. Well, 20 years later, I wrote another edition of the book, a new part 3, arguing that everything had changed. The religion wars radically cooled. So, Ryan, when was the last time you read about an evolution creation battle in a local school district? By the way, I'm somewhat of a nerd on these things. They do still happen, but in a very minor key. Ditto for battles over Bible reading and school prayer. We've seen a little of that surface in Oklahoma and in Louisiana recently, but only a little bit. And even sex ed has become much less controversial. The reasons for this are pretty simple. The most devout Americans in the past 20 years have abandoned the public schools, not completely, but in large measure, either going to these Christian academies or homeschooling. So you take those people out of the equation and it makes sense there's going to be less controversy over these matters. Also, Americans as a whole have gotten less religious. This is the most important thing I think that's happened in America that we talk the least about because we're so close to it. So the way that scholars measure this is reported weekly worship services and reported belief in God. And those things have gone down 20% in 20 years. So we're a less religious country. But here's the thing. Remember, I said in 2002, the history wars had the wrong solution because we just added new groups to the same story instead of debating the story. Well, here's what happened. We're debating the story now. I mean, you live in San Francisco and you live in a place where, there were battles to rename schools named after Lincoln and Jefferson because, Jefferson owned slaves and Lincoln arguably had racist views. I think the larger question of the meaning of America has become much more contested than ever before. The problem is that we don't have a language for talking about our different views of it. And the reason is, and here's the real takeaway, Ryan, as we got less religious in a formal way, blue and red became our religions. So they became religions in the sense that they became kind of organizing principles that people didn't question, but rather used as a kind of cudgel, a kind of weapon against non-believers. And I think that's what you're seeing with red and blue. The idea that my team has a kind of monopoly on truth, and your team, it's not just that they're wrong, they're evil or stupid or misguided. And so red and blue have become quasi-religions. And the problem is they don't actually allow for a lot of conversation between them because they don't have the tempering effect that former religion has. So Christianity says, love thy neighbor as thyself. Now, not all Christians necessarily abide by or practice that principle, but it is part of the gospel. Blue and red don't say that. They don't say, oh, love the other team as yourself. They say, no, the other team is a dagger at the heart of the nation. The other team has to be blotted out. Don't talk to it. I mean, back to the conversation thing. Why have a conversation with the other team if the other team is evil? So I think that's where we live, and you can see it playing out in history instruction. Think about something like the 1619 Project or critical race theory. I mean, these are all things that have now been banned by state legislatures across America. You're in California, and so that hasn't happened because you're in a blue state. But if you look at the red states, they've banned these perspectives. And that tells you, I think, all you need to know. We don't need to talk about the 1619 Project. We need to eliminate it.
First of all, I want to say your whole idea of blue or red being our new religions, that was like one of the most interesting takeaways I had from the whole program. That was something I never
It's not original to me. There's a guy who I think is brilliant named Shahid Hamid who writes for the Atlantic, and that's where I got the idea actually. Yeah.
cool. And I also want to let's keep talking about what you're saying about the 1619 and critical race theory. Like, why does this new reframing of American history threaten some people? And
Well, oh no, sorry, go ahead.
and why do these progressions what do these progressions truly add to education that many can't think about because of such polarization?
Well, look, when Republicans in those red states say that the 1619 Project represents a fundamental challenge to the way that many or most Americans learn history, they're right. They're right. I just think it's a good challenge or could be a good challenge if we addressed it as such. I don't think they're wrong about that. I mean, just look at the title. I mean, 1619 Project, of course, right? The title comes from the year that enslaved Africans arrived on American shores. So if you're making that the central event in the history of the country, you're telling a very different story than, say, a textbook with a title like the one I had as a kid, Quest for Liberty. I mean, think about the contrast there. It's very sharp. The problem is that we don't have enough will, I would say, on either side to use these different narratives to really teach ourselves and to teach each other. I think the 1619 Project represents what we educators call a great teachable moment, if we could leverage it. And as I told the group when I met with you all, if I were king, and we don't have enough time this morning to enumerate all the reasons that won't happen, but if I were in charge, every high school teacher would give students the 1619 Project and the state-approved textbook, Quest for Liberty or whatever it's called, and say, okay, let's start with Columbus. What does 1619 say? What does your textbook say? Let's do the American Revolution. What does 1619 say? What does your textbook say? And I think the students would learn an extraordinary amount from that exercise. The problem is we don't have the will to do it. We could. We're a democracy, right? If enough people wanted what I just described to happen, Ryan, it would happen. It would. The reason it hasn't is not enough of us want it, and that's the heart of the problem.
And I was actually just about to ask about that exercise because I remember it from your lecture, just thinking that that is a really great way to learn. I mean, I feel like that would probably help us a lot.
Well, I'm sure it would help us, but the question is, who am I? I mean, I am sure of that. I believe in it deeply. I'm trying to make the case for it here and in lots of other venues. But Ryan, I'll be honest, I feel like I've failed. I'm not going to stop trying because I don't know what else to do. But this appeal that I keep making is falling on deaf ears. The other thing that I've kept making a plea for is the America Hour. So on Wednesday at noon, and it might be 9 a.m. where you live, we could adjust the time. What would happen was if you lived in San Francisco like you did, Ryan, like you do, you would be paired with a school in northern Alabama, in the reddest place in America. And for an hour each week, the teachers would lead the students in a discussion of everything that is in the newspapers: abortion rights, the war in the Ukraine, whether Kamala Harris is really black, whatever it might be. Um, uh, and to your point, I think kids in both places would learn a huge amount from that exercise. You could do gun control, you could do Obamacare, you could do it all, right? But again, you need a will to do that. And I think a lot of people in San Francisco would say, why should I talk to those stupid, Trump-loving evangelical Christians in Northern Alabama? And I think a lot of people in Northern Alabama would say, like, why should I talk to those libtards, those like LGBTQ rainbow flying freaks with differently colored hair in San Francisco?
I don't know how to respond to that, but that's a really interesting concept. So, one thing you explained in your lecture was how these issues of, the name calling you just exemplified, how that can be exacerbated in modern times due to social media. So, what mediums of social media can this be found in and how? And is there a way to live without social media, or sorry, to live with social media without falling prey to such problems?
Well, look, I mean, um, the reason I'm laughing is because this is the question of the day. Social media is not going away, and none of us should imagine that it will. However, I do think there are things as a culture we could do to, let's just say, reduce its power without eliminating that power. So Jonathan Haidt has a new book out about this subject. And one of the things that he pleads for is for schools to exclude phones, which, by the way, an increasing number of them are. So is that going to solve the problem you're talking about? Of course not. But for about 8 hours of the day, it is, right? I think it would also have great effects on school itself because students would be less distracted. So, I mean, that's an example. And I do think we're going in that direction. It's taking some time. But of course, to your point, that does leave the other 16 hours, right? I think the whole question of the regulation of the internet and of social media obviously is very much in play, right? Think of the whole dispute over TikTok and who owns it, and think of the new bill in Congress about requiring social media companies to ban things that involve bullying and harassment. I have some mixed feelings about those rules only because I think they could be misapplied in all kinds of ways. But let me just say this. If we do succeed in getting the phones out of schools, it gives us 8 hours to teach another way of doing politics, right? I know there's 16 other hours, but hopefully for at least 2 of them, the teenagers will be asleep, right? But at least we will have 8 hours to teach people how to interact in a humane and a real life way. I mean, I've banned technology from my classroom for a number of years. Remember, I teach at college. And by the way, this is a huge problem in college too. But I looked, Ryan, recently at my teacher evaluations from last semester, and one student wrote, Zimmerman runs a tech-free classroom, so we actually looked at each other. It was amazing. And again, I know that it was written as a compliment and I took it as such, but it's also very poignant, right? Think of what the student is saying. She's saying in my other classes, we're just doing this, we're not. And I just did the iPhone prayer position. We're not even making eye contact with each other. So I do think we need to teach a different way of exchange, a more mutually respectful and informed way. And Ryan, the only public institution we have for doing that is the school. There's no other option. Obviously, we have many other institutions, but most of them are private, like the media companies, like families, like voluntary organizations. The school is a public institution. I think it's the only one that can really make a dent in this problem. So I don't think there is, let me put it this way, there's no real solution that doesn't involve schools, as best I can tell. I haven't heard of one.
Well, can this teaching be applied to adults? Because I'm pretty sure that on social media, in terms of politics, the most active people are old people.
Oh, everyone becomes a teenager. I mean, that's the problem with social media. Everyone just, everyone becomes like a mean, gossipy, canceling teenager. I mean, it's to me, it's an adolescent medium in so many ways. And what it does is it makes us all adolescents at a certain level. So I'm not trying to say that the teenagers are any worse. Au contraire, I mean, I think the adults are worse because frankly, they should know better. Their brains aren't still in development, right? But I think this medium has created a kind of arrested development that's all around us. By the way, I don't do social media just because I know it wouldn't be good for me. I'm also a newspaper columnist, and so people talk shit about me constantly on social media. And every so often, like a friend will send me a paste in from social media and about something I've written. And I'm like, oh, so that's why I'm not on social media. Like I just have no desire to see it. It doesn't get me closer to God.
I mean, yeah, I know you're not on social media because of your flip phone that you showed us,
Exactly. Exactly. There it is. Yeah.
but can you even text on that?
Oh, yes. That's why I got it. When my kids were teenagers, they just said, look, Dad, we're not going to talk to you on the phone. We're only going to text with you. So I had no choice. So yeah, I can. I mean, obviously, my friends and family find it hilarious that I have to do the thing you never did, which is, hit a button 3 times to get to see, right? Because you have a keyboard that looks like a laptop or a typewriter keyboard, and I still have that one, right?
Oh,
Right.
oh,
But it allows me to do what I need to do, which is, I'm going to be late. How are you doing? And so on. Yeah.
that's good. Okay. So, with elections on the horizon, political fanaticism is going to reach an all-time high again, especially this one. So, how will these relationships fare this year, and how do the highly polarized conditions of this election and later its outcome impact our already fragmented society, as we've talked about?
Well, look, I mean, I that's the question of the day. I think it's still too early to know what the next couple of months are going to hold. Um, uh, it is at least possible, note I said possible, that the election could have a tempering effect on some of our worst features insofar as it does promote more dialogue across our differences. I don't know. But here's the thing. The one thing I do know is that schools have to teach people a better way. So even though I have no idea what's going to happen in the political realm, I do at least hope that because school is about to start up, that what our schools will be doing at every level is exposing our students to the debates and the differences between Harris and Trump and helping them, that is, the students, come to their own views of the election. The job of the school is not to get people to vote one way or the other. The job of the school is to help people develop the knowledge and the skills to be competent voters. That's different. And I think the only way to do that is to expose them to these differences. So, like I said, if we want a better America, it has to start in the schools. And just like the 1619 Project, I would argue that this election represents a fantastic teachable moment. We should be using this moment to teach our students, and specifically to teach our students about the important issues of the day, and most of all, how to disagree across them. That's what we need to do from Labor Day through November 5th.
Well, what would you think is the first steps for schools that haven't really started that process?
I think the first step is to set aside some time in the day or the week where this happens and to identify teachers that have the will and the skill to do that. Not all of them do, right? Teachers are no different from doctors or lawyers or engineers. They're good ones and bad ones. And they're ones with different sets of skills and capacities. So what I would hope is that schools, A, identify the teachers with the will and skill to do that, and also set aside time in the day and the week for students to talk about this stuff. That's what we need.
Yeah. And I will say at my school, things like this is happening. But then
Good.
I am privileged enough to go to a private school, and I think it'd be great to see this more in more public
Right.
institutions.
Well, it's interesting, the private schools they do have more leeway in this matter, right? Um, because, you know, if a patron, if your parents or any other family that patronizes a private school, if they don't like what the private school is doing about the election or anything, if they go and complain, the private school is within its rights to say, look, if you don't like what we're doing, maybe you should take your business elsewhere. That's a totally legitimate thing for a private school to do. A public school can't do that, right? The public school can't say, like, why don't you sell your house and move to a different catchment? So it's harder for public schools. The private schools have more autonomy, they have more leeway.
Yeah. So, final question here. This podcast was created as an attempt to educate the youth and find the truth in a time where there are many versions of what is considered factual. In doing so, even I have definitely received some backlash from people who believe some of my episodes promote a more progressive agenda. With all of this extreme polarization and lack of communication on all sides going on, how can one person, and let's take a listener of this podcast, change their own behaviors to better promote productive discussions and bridge this divide?
Ah, well, that's the rare question I actually have an answer to. My students are tired of this because when they ask me a question, inevitably I just ask them one. What do you mean by that? Or yeah, what do you think? Well, here's one that I can absolutely answer. Here's what every individual can do. They can carefully, willfully consume media that wasn't made for them. That's the special sauce. The problem with our environment right now is we all get a news feed on our phones. I don't because I have a flip phone, but 98% of Americans do, or 95. And what is that news feed? That news feed is information that's been curated for your search history and therefore for your biases. So it's going to reflect and echo and reinforce those biases. So um, a news feed is it's the medium's effort to reinforce everything you thought and to prevent you from encountering things that are different from what you think. And the only way you can change that, again, is through your will, is by finding other sites and other media that wasn't made for you. So I try to watch some Fox News every night because I know that if I just watch MSNBC or CNN, I'll see my worldview confirmed. And that doesn't actually educate me. The way we learn is by being exposed to things that are not us. That's how we learn. But given the dominance of the news feed, the only way you can make that happen is, again, by exerting your will, is by being purposeful and mindful and thoughtful about it.
Of course. And I will say, I believe you mentioned your Fox News thing at your lecture, and I tried that too. So the other night I was looking at Fox News and was surprised to see that what they were reporting on was like not Tim Walz's speech, but rather that maybe what did they say? That he's not a veteran or that he didn't actually go into battle. So that was
Yes.
interesting.
Yep. They're reporting the J.D. Vance thing that it's a repeat of the John Kerry stuff about stolen valor. And again, Ryan, I should be honest. I I think that is a scurrilous charge. But if you didn't watch Fox News, you might not know that that's even happening. And you should know it. You should.
I would
Yeah.
not have thought about that beforehand.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, thank you so
Great.
much for joining me today. It has been really interesting talking to you. Since the
Ryan,
moment I
thank
saw you,
you.
since the moment I
Yeah.
saw you at the lecture and hearing you talk, I just thought this is new, and it was really great to hear from you.
Good. Well, I really appreciate that. And when this goes live, if you could send me a link, that would be
Oh yeah,
great.
of course. Yeah.
Thanks for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Professor Zimmerman.
Okay. All right. Have a good one.
You too. That's it for the 37th episode of A Change of the Champs. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you in the next episode.